I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. Hello and welcome to a special episode of Postcards from a Dying World. I have already been nerding out with Ray Nayler for a little bit about Philip K. Dick, but we're here to talk about his work and his debut novel, Mountain in the Sea, which at this point in the year is my favorite read of the year, one of my favorite reads of the last couple years. I'm David Agranoff. I'm the host of this here podcast. I'm the author of the upcoming The Last Night to Kill Nazis, which is a World War II. It takes place in the last day of World War II with vampires. And I'm doing a book tour for that, so I have to promote that in Southern California with Cody Goodfellow and John Shirley in San Diego, LA, and Encinitas, September 14th through the 17th. So I definitely want to see folks out there for that, and we'll have fun, cool stuff to give away there. But on to the show proper. Ray Nayler is a longtime columnist with Asimov's, correct? You've written a lot of columns for Asimov, and
not columns, but I've written a lot of short stories for them.
Yeah,
I also wrote one editorial for them. Yeah.
Okay, you've been in Asimov's a lot. I know that, and that's one of the ways that most people knew you before this book hit the streets. And let me tell you, the buzz already about Mountain in the Sea is off the charts. And I heard so much buzz about it that I went into it cold. I got the book without knowing a single thing about it. I just knew that I heard the buzz. And I recommend that people read it that way. If they can pause and come back, I suppose, if they trust me. But we're going to talk about the book, and I'm mostly going to I'm not going to promise to stay spoiler free because I really want to talk about a lot of the aspects of the book, but I will give a spoiler warning before we get super serious towards the end, just to let people know that ahead of time. But if you trust me that this is a masterpiece, and anybody who listens to my podcast knows I love to nerd out about process. So we're going to do a lot of process talk. Ray, can you tell the folks who you are and where you came from with this debut novel?
Yes. So let's see where to start. I was born in Quebec, grew up in California, in the San Francisco Bay Area, mostly in Fremont, California, which is kind of a part of Silicon Valley, South Bay. Now it's all been absorbed by San Jose and all that stuff there.
Right.
Went to UC Santa Cruz for my undergrad. Took a degree in modern literature, and then I joined the Peace Corps in 2003, and I went to Turkmenistan. And from 2003 to 2022, I basically lived overseas, either as a Peace Corps volunteer or afterwards working in some international education programming. And then after that, I joined the Foreign Service in 2010. And The Mountain in the Sea comes out of my work in the Foreign Service in Vietnam on the Con Dao archipelago where the book is set. And then other parts of it are set in other places where I've lived and worked. But yeah, throughout all that, that's kind of my day job stuff. Now I'm back in the United States. I work for NOAA in their Marine Protected Areas Center as their international advisor. In August, I'll go change jobs again, and I'll be at George Washington University as their diplomat in residence and a resident scholar there for a year, visiting scholar. That should be fun in their International Science and Technology Policy Institute.
I like that campus a lot. I went to a very radical conference there once, so
awesome!
I appreciate it.
It's great. It's down sort of downtown, and the nice thing is it's not that far from my daughter's daycare, so it shortens my sort of commute and stuff. That'll be good. But yeah, I first published in Asimov's in 2015, and that was my first science fiction publication. But before that, I wrote a lot of crime fiction and noir and a lot of just everything, poetry, travelogues, lots of stuff. Ever since I was 16, published my first novella when I was 25. So it's kind of been one of these things where a lot of people know me as a science fiction writer, but I've got 30 years of writing in general under my belt. So I didn't kind of come from nowhere in 2015. But what happened was I had been writing in other genres. I had never written anything science fiction. I got a science fiction idea and I decided I would write it. The idea was pretty simple. It was just the idea that if we live forever, it wouldn't matter very much because we can't remember anything that happened like 40 or 50 years ago very well. So we would just be these drifting kind of 80-year chunks of knowledge that moved, forward through time and slowly lost the memories of things that had happened to us a long time ago. And the story was called Mutability. I followed my own policy, which is I submit to the top magazines first because, if you're going to get rejected, aim high. And I submitted to Asimov's, and Sheila Williams there decided to publish the story. And so after that, I started publishing in Asimov's and then Clark's World, Analog as well, Nightmare and Lightspeed, and the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. I think I've had maybe somewhere between 25 and 30 professional sales. And then I started writing The Mountain and the Sea in 2019.
Now, before we get into how you got into science fiction, do you consider yourself a science fiction writer, or did that just kind of happen? And do you still consider yourself just a writer? Because I know some people kind of, bristle at the time. We know Philip K. Dick had a hard time with the concept of science fiction writer and had to kind of accept it at a certain point.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that I bristle at it. I have a lot of respect for science fiction, and so I don't think that it's anything. I don't think there's anything bad about being called a science fiction writer. I don't take it as an insult. I don't feel limited by that. And I certainly didn't start out as a science fiction writer. And I'm not a science fiction. I would say this. I may be right now very much a writer of speculative fiction because I do write some horror and other things as well. I also continue to write mainstream short stories and published a few in the last few years. But I'm largely writing in the science fiction genre because that's kind of where my mind is right now. And
well, you're damn good at it.
Thank you. Thank you. But I'm not a science fiction reader. And I think that's what makes me a little bit different as a science fiction writer. And I don't mean that I don't read science fiction, but that science fiction probably only accounts for between, say, 2 and 5% of my writing intake, most of which is science writing, nonfiction, and like other things. And when I read fiction, I'm largely reading like mainstream kind of stuff right now, but I mean that changes over time. So I'm not as like genre knowledgeable as I would like to be sometimes about things, and there's big holes in my sort of science fiction knowledge. But I'm also like really aware of not wanting to copy people accidentally and not wanting to absorb too much. So I do sort of protect myself from that, I think, by staying outside of the genre as much as I can in my reading habits. So yeah, I mean, I'm sort of neutral about the term. What I don't like about it is, well, it's like anything else. A qualification is always sounds like a qualification, right? So science fiction writer just sounds like it's less than simply writer because it implies that there's other things that you can't do. And I don't like that part of it. I don't like to feel like I'm being pigeonholed. At the same time, I don't buy any of the negative stereotypes about science fiction that kind of float around. So I'm not hurt by being called a science fiction writer.
Well, John Shirley, one of my mentors in Cyberpunk Legend, he doesn't read science fiction anymore either. Hasn't in a very long time. mostly doesn't read fiction very much anymore, unless we push them and say, like, for example, your book is one book that I told him, I was like, John, you really got to read this.
Thank
And for example, but and I think that sometimes that whole like trying to be conscious of not wanting to be derivative of what everybody else is doing is a strong pull to that. But who were your early influences in science fiction? Who were the ones that you read early in your life, or that you feel like, kind of got your brain thinking speculatively in general?
Well, I mean, I wasn't in general thinking speculatively, so it's kind of interesting, right? I mostly started writing like noir and kind of crime fiction and
Right.
detective fiction. So if I was going to say who my big influences were, it was like Patricia Highsmith, Dorothy B. Hughes, Raymond Chandler, um, people like that. And they sort of remain Dashiell Hammett, right? And they sort of remain my influences as a writer, because I think that I think that some of the best writing sentence for sentence has been done in crime fiction, in American crime fiction especially. And people like Dorothy B. Hughes is really hard to beat, especially if you're talking about like free and direct discourse and this kind of like amazing things that she's able to do with point of view, and some of those things that I still go back and sort of study. Like reading the beginning of her book, The Expendable Man. There's like this moment where you're like, holy crap.
Right.
About 40 or 50 pages in, where all of the weird things that are going on suddenly click for you, and you realize what she's done with point of view. It's really amazing. So I kind of, writing wise, that's been my school of a sort. And then, but when you're talking about like science fiction writers, James Tiptree Jr., right? Alice Sheldon. I mean, I I really admire the writers who really cared about atmosphere and style a lot. Not style over substance, but like the use of style as a way of telling a story. I really like Gene Wolfe, and this is kind of since I've started writing science fiction more. Philip K. Dick, I grew up reading. But when I started reading, I had an odd kind of journey into science fiction, because when I started reading as a little kid, my mother was very much like a classicist, and she really wanted me to read Shakespeare, and she really wanted me to read like the canon. This is like when I was 6, right? So when I read science fiction, she was like, okay, well, you could read science fiction, but you're going to read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. You're going to read like Wells, and you're going to read all of these like classics. So I was a kid in the 80s reading stuff from like the late 19th and early 20th century more than I was reading the other stuff, because my reading was sort of dictated for a long time by my mother's interests in in guiding my reading. And I'm extremely happy for that, because I feel like I got very grounded in that science fiction before moving on to the sort of American golden age stuff.
Right.
So I have it gives me a bit of a different sort of idea about what science fiction is, and kind of where it comes from. Like a little bit less in some ways parochial, I feel like, than people who grew up on the American stuff and the pulps only, and don't see back past that to Poe and all of these sort of antecedents to the genre.
Have you read
Which I
much
also read a lot.
have you read much Tony Boucher? Have you read any of, because he did both worlds. He was a crime. It's funny because the crime and mystery people claim him and think he's theirs, and then the sci-fi people also,
Yeah.
because he founded
Yeah.
Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. So
Right. And there's so much crossover between those genres too. I think that especially when people were working as writers and doing the the short story market and the pulps, and then like the paperback originals and stuff, you got a lot of crossover. Like I think about who would be a good example? Fritz Lieber, right?
Yeah.
You know, there like he could almost write in any genre. I think Ray Bradbury is another
Mhm.
example. Like he
Totally.
always had the feeling of writing just genre. Like it sort of crossed over wherever he wanted it to go, right? It could be a little
Mhm.
detective-y, it could be a little more over here. You know, you would think you were getting a science fiction story, but it would end up in horror, you know, et cetera. I think people were a little bit more flexible. I also think that a lot of the genre definitions and the canon were formed later than they were defined much later, and so their definitions are quite often an attempt to constrain genre to a certain viewpoint.
Mhm.
Um, so if you sort of listen to some of the descriptions of what golden age science fiction was, it actually doesn't include something like 80% probably of the writers who were working in golden age science fiction, right?
Mhm.
There's no good definition of what was really going on unless you reduce it to just a few of the figures in a big field.
Well, without Tony Boucher too, we wouldn't have Philip K. Dick, because it was him wandering into Dick's record store to buy opera records and them talking, which really, like, Phil had so much respect for Tony because he had gotten to the point where he thought sci-fi was kid stuff and he didn't
Mm,
want anything to do with it. And then Tony Boucher says, "Oh, well, if you want to write science fiction, on Thursday nights I teach the $1 class." And by the
uh-huh.
way, that house has a plaque outside of it in Berkeley if anyone
Is
wants to
it?
go visit it, which is really cool. But anyways, on to this book. Let's get into Mountain in the Sea, because I think we got a good idea of where you came from writing wise. It sounds like that reading background was a huge part of what got you interested in being a writer. Is it sounds like your mom was serious about you reading, and I think anybody that's, for example, in my household, reading was a very serious thing too. And I
Mhm,
think those of us who grow up with that serious reading often want to try our hand at this. We want to
mhm,
do it, right?
mhm.
So, you were writing short stories, but do you remember where the inspiration for Mountain in the Sea came? Were you looking for an idea to expand into a novel, or was it a short story that kind of just kept growing in your mind? How did it start?
So I was really interested in, uh, and I still am interested in biosemiotics, and I was reading a lot about biosemiotics, which is basically like an expansion of the idea of semiotics to biology. So the idea is that life is fundamentally about communication, and that's between cellular signaling all the way up through culture, right?
Hmm.
And that the physical sort of strata that communication occurs in is not the primary thing to study, but the primary thing to study in biology is signaling systems and messaging, how DNA and RNA and these kinds of things, build a creature, how that organism, then interacts with its environment, et cetera. And I was thinking of a way to tie this into my science fiction work. And I had written a few things. I wrote a short story called Eyes of the Forest, which was sort of experiment in some elaborate world building where the world consists of things that give off light while they're alive. And there are no predators in the world, but anything that ceases to give off light is immediately scavenged. And so it's like this adventure story where the people who are attempting to live on that planet have to wear these suits that give off light, all the time. And anytime there's like any like area of darkness, they're immediately just set upon by these by the inhabitants of this world.
I love that idea. That sounds very interesting.
Yeah, I think it's a fun story. It was also a story I wrote because someone was like, well, Ray Nayler writes these sort of languid philosophical stories. And I was like, okay, well, I'm going to write a story that is action from the moment the story begins until the moment it ends and never lets up. And there's just like one punch after another. And so that was Eyes of the Forest, was also sort of a trying to like thumb my nose at people's expectations of me as a writer. Um, and then I wrote another one called Albedo Season, about like a moon, a population on a moon that is trying to figure out how to avert an ecological crisis and how they might have contributed to it. Has some obvious parallels with, you know, global warming and things like that, but it's also about like sort of plant signaling and things like that. And I started getting really into this concept of communications and the difficulty of it. Wrote a couple more short stories in that similar vein, and then I wrote a novella, which I have just kept back from publishing, called The Atlas of Inhuman Color. And that novella was very much about some of the things that would grow into the mountain and the sea. So it was about this, you know, attempt to establish communication between humans and another species that's attained symbolic communication. So in the mountain and the sea, it's an octopus. I don't want to give too much away because I may, you know, use this novella later, but in the Atlas of Inhuman Color, it's a very different thing. But in fact, the main character of the Atlas of Inhuman Color, I recycled so much of them into Ha, the main character in the mountain and the sea, that I had to hold it back, because I would need to now go back and rewrite that protagonist to make them different from Ha.
Gotcha. Well, and it's interesting because we have very different backgrounds, you and I, but like where our minds meet in this book, kind of it's funny because a lot of the things that you feel in this book and you express in this book are things that were very near and dear to my heart as far as like views. But it's funny because and I think it'll become clear to people as like we go on in this discussion, but I just want to give a little bit of my, you know, where I come to this novel from, because I mentioned this in my review, and I think this is important for how I took the book, is that, you know, I'm a hardcore militant vegan that came out of the vegan straight edge punk rock hardcore movement, and you know, got into things through bands like Earth Crisis and Vegan Reich and stuff like that. And like in the late 90s, there was this novel Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. I don't know if you've read it, but okay. So I kept thinking about Ishmael a lot when I was reading your book. And the book Ishmael was very popular in our scene. In fact, there were people, bands writing entire concept albums about it, people getting tattoos, and like it was, and the whole book is about a gorilla who puts an ad in the paper and says, teacher looking for student, and the student shows up, and the teacher's a gorilla, and he's basically trying to tell him, hey, this is how you view the world. I want to tell you how we view the world and how you see it differently, right? And the whole that whole book is basically trying to get humans to think, you know, outside of their thing. And it was funny because the whole time I was reading Mountain and the Sea, I was like, if this book came out in the late 90s, the hardcore scene would have adopted this book like they did Ishmael, because what I think is so special about this book is it challenges the way we as a species think about our planet. And I didn't know if I had a feeling like whether that's how I interpret the book. Did you have a feeling that was going to be something that came out of this, or do you even see it that way? Because I'm just telling you my interpretation from reading it, but I don't even know if that's an interpretation that you share, right?
Yeah, thank you. I'm really glad that you liked the book so much, and I read the review, and it was really very flattering. Thank you. I'm glad that it was, you know, it was intended to be a book that started conversations about things, and I wanted it to be this. I mean, I really believe that a book should be this kind of opening up into conversations about something. Like, I don't want the book to be didactic. I want the book to be a way of kind of asking lots of complex questions and getting the reader involved in continuing to think about those questions after they've closed the pages or while they're reading the book, and having it be more than just an experience of sort of, reading straight through the book, but rather like hopefully leaving them with something that they keep coming back to. Because I always think about fiction as having this possibility of being structured a little bit more like an album, something that you can kind of continually come back to and enjoy, rather than something that is just like a linear path through a narrative. And I really wanted The Mountain and the Sea to be that. I mean, my own personal viewpoint on these issues is that I don't think that human beings are really smart enough to understand how smart animals are. And what I mean by that is that, I try to be very careful about the way that I talk about this book, because I constantly see it reviewed as a book about sentient octopuses. And I keep trying to, correct people and say, if you want a book about sentient octopuses, you can read a book about octopuses.
Right.
Right? Because all octopuses are clearly sentient. Sentience is most likely a function of complex choice making. Like, as choices that it's possible for an animal to make become increasingly complex, consciousness has to rise up in order to make those decisions, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can say that there probably is something that it is like to be an octopus that is quite clearly a consciousness, right? Mm-hmm. How far that goes down the chain in the animal kingdom is certainly like an open question. Like, is there something that it's like to be a tick, right? Is there something that it's like to be an ant? To be a mouse? I think that there's probably a level beneath which, like, the threshold is that there's things that are alive that aren't very sentient, right? Aren't very aware of life. But that's not a solved problem either, right?
Right. Well, Stanislaw Lem in 1968 wrote his master's voice, and that entire book, and that book is not one that most people will want to read, because the entire book is about failed attempts at communicating with higher species. Right? And I did think about that book a little bit too when I was reading this one. And it's funny because that book kind of puts forward the idea that we may be the ticks, right? And and that book is basically just, we tried and we can't. We can't communicate with them. And that book is not one that you can be like, hey, you're gonna love this book. It's about a failure to communicate, right?
Right. I actually like, so Stanislaw, so Liam I usually read in Russian because I'm bilingual and speak Russian as well. And Liam I usually read in Russian because his Polish originals are well translated into Russian. So I try to kind of
fascinating. That's
challenge
great.
myself. Yeah. And those two languages are quite close. So a lot of the structures are going to be similar and stuff. And so I think you get closer to Liam by reading him in Russian than you would in English. But I haven't read that one in Russian. I have read Возвращение со звезды, Return from the Stars, right?
Okay.
Which I think is a brilliant one. And
I'm jealous of your ability to do that.
It's and then Invincible, right? Непобедимые. Yeah, Invincible. About the spaceship that gets, it's basically he invents nanotechnology.
Right.
In this, like, 50 years before anyone was thinking about it. It's quite extraordinary, because it's like this really good description of how sort of nanotechnology evolves out of larger technological structures, right? It's fascinating. But so yeah, I think it's for me, what I wanted out of this book was I was always like one of these kids who was not so much asking the question why as asking the question how, right? Mm-hmm. Always been really interested in like the details about how things are done and how they happen. And I think that's what attracts me to science. I've always been really attracted to science, although that's not what I ended up getting my degree in. It's not like that path that I pursued. It's always something I've been interested in, because I'm really fundamentally interested in like the difficulties of things and the technical details. And my father's a hardware engineer,
Mm.
Silicon Valley, and our whole family practically was sort of saturated in that engineering problem solving era of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and the aughts in Silicon Valley. He's now retired, but he was a part of all that. And I would watch these first contact movies, and I would read the books, and I would always come away a little bit cold and think, well, that's great and it's very creative and I appreciate that, but I don't think it really attacks the question of how communication occurs and like the embodiment of meaning and all these things that we know about the difficulty of communication. And so I wanted to write a book that was more about the difficulties of that, but not to the point of his master's voice, like saying that's fundamentally impossible. I mean, I do think that Lim was very embittered by the environment that he was writing in as well, in many ways. And he does, I've read some of his like essays and commentary. He was extremely dismissive of American science fiction, but he also just was living in a very depressing situation of communist Poland and like the Eastern Bloc, and so the way he sees the world is very grim, and it comes across. I'm a little more.
I will say though that in 115 episodes of this podcast, when I read Len, I usually read him in Russian, is the best humble brag on this show yet. I got to say, that's going to go down as. But back to what you were saying about communicating with animals and the level of animal sentience. For me, I had a situation where I became vegan 30 years ago. It just happens to be that it's my 30th anniversary was last January.
Oh,
and when I first became vegan back in 1993, I did an internship at Farm Sanctuary for a summer because somebody suggested to me, like, hey, if you're serious about this, like, put your activism into, and now there's farm sanctuaries all over the country, but at the time there was one, right? And when I went there for the summer, when I first became vegan, like, I didn't really eat vegetables and I had to like learn how to re-eat because like I had a terrible standard American diet. But one thing that happened to me there was, now they had these cows that got massive because they weren't killed when they got to slaughter size, right? And they became enormous, and they had this whole herd that all hung out together. And there was a cow there named Jackson, who was kind of like this patriarch of the herd. And when Jackson died the summer I was there, he had a spot where he would go eat hay every morning that was like Jackson's spot. And the day after he died, all the cows like gathered around his spot, and they started making this sound that I will never forget. And I admit at the time I wasn't locked into being vegan. But when I saw that, it changed everything about how I saw the animal kingdom, basically. When I saw cows mourning, when I saw them having this horrible reaction to their friend being gone, right? And not being there. And it just changed everything for how I saw things. And I'm wondering, because you do such a great job in this book of highlighting, and you said it with like octopus, like, if you want to see their sentience, just read about octopuses. Did you have a moment where the sentience of non-human animals became a more like something that you had to write about, or something that you really wanted to express, because you do so beautifully in this book?
That's a really moving story about the cows.
Sorry.
I think that I really thank you for that. It's actually really it reminds me that a lot of the ways in which we think about animals, we probably think about them because they are so often pushed into these extraordinarily distancing industrial processes. So we don't see them as animals. We just see them as a product. And if I can have permission to kind of digress a little bit.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I would say that
your book we're talking about.
Thank you. Seeing things as products and being able to distance ourselves from them is probably one of the main universal flaws in modern society, is that we're able to push so much of our consumption and the underlying sort of structures that produce those products of consumption away from us, and we don't have to feel for those things or have empathy for them. That that lack of involvement and that lack of connection to the things themselves, right, that we are consuming, and the ways in which they come into, like, they come past that screen of ignorance and then into our world for consumption is a huge part of the problem. And the part in The Mountain and the Sea that's about the AI fishing vessel, you know, there's a part during that where there's a character who's enslaved on this AI fishing vessel, and this you will find out early in the book, so it's not really a spoiler. But there's a part in which he sort of meditates. One of the other characters meditates on the fact that once he had a normal life in which things like being enslaved on a fishing vessel were not popular and were not possible, and then he fell through like a hole in the world into this other place where that became a possibility, and he became a slave on that fishing vessel. You know, arguably, one of the big themes in the book is really about trying to get beyond that veil of ignorance and become involved in real ways in what's real, in what I'd like to sort of push on people as the new realism. Like, we have a concept of realism that's based around things like, oh, well, you know, maybe you don't think this is good for you, but it's expedient, so it's going to happen anyway. So don't question it, right? Or like ChatGPT is a really good example, or, you know, some of our other uses of AI or any sort of mechanization that takes jobs. It's like, well, it's just, you know, be realistic. Like, these things are going to happen, and so you're just going to have to get used to it. I'd say that flipping that, what realism really is understanding that there are fundamental limits to what the environment can bear, right? And that animals have things like consciousness and feelings about their lives, and that a lot of the things we don't care about, nevertheless, do not cease to be worth caring about, right? Like, we may have abstracted ourselves from the fact that we just tear cows' bodies apart and consume them, but that doesn't stop it from happening somewhere, right? From being real. And I think a new realism would be something like what William S. Burroughs suggests, right? In The Naked Lunch, seeing what is on your fork when you put it into your mouth, and taking that as a wider metaphor, like recognizing what the consequences are of your existence on this planet, right? And recognizing your attachment to the ecosystem and the environment. These are not hippy dippy sort of concepts. Like, this is real, right? Like, your plastics consumption has an impact on the environment. You know, all of these things have an impact, and anyone who has a pet knows that it's totally possible to communicate with animals. We do it every day. That they're woven into human society in fundamental ways, that they have a being, right? That they have feelings, they can be hurt, they can feel fear and pain, they bear psychological scars from things that happen to them. They have complex interactions with one another. Like, we know these things. We just don't know them when it's inconvenient to us to know them. We forget them, and we push them away from ourselves. And I think, you know, we need to live in a realistic manner, and a realistic life is one that actually addresses what we're doing to the planet and what its consequences are, and not just shoving those aside. And so it's the communication with animals has to come across this barrier of what we've done as a species, right? And that's sort of talked about in the book as well, is like, how would an octopus see people, right? I mean, people are a species that rips octopi out of their homes, right? And
the quote in your book is, "We're monsters to octopuses, hunters, destroyers, killing their relatives, laying waste to their world." I had this ready. And they are monsters to us. Their motivations inexplicable, their minds totally alien.
Yeah.
And that part, I mean, I quoted it in my review because it stopped me dead in my tracks, because it's a thing that's not new or like mind bending to me, but it's awesome to see it in a science fiction novel because I don't always see it there, right? And
Yeah. Yeah.
and I hope other people who maybe don't have those thoughts all the time get their mind open to those types of thoughts by reading this book. Um, and on that, I would ask the question, and I don't know if this is a great segue,
Mhm.
but I think this book has a lot to say about what it means to think and to communicate. And I think in that sense, and believe me, I think the foundation of storytelling, and anybody who listens to 114 of my podcasts is already saying these words because I say it all the time: parallels and reversals. To
Mm.
me, is storytelling, parallels and reversals. And one of the parallels in this story is all the AI stuff with the animal stuff. Like, this book is talking about what it means to think and to communicate.
Mhm.
And you couldn't have known that orcas were going to start sabotaging boats in Spain. You probably didn't know when you wrote this that Chat GPT would become a thing that like anybody could use.
Right.
Right. But your book became this ripped out of the headlines thing with what does it mean for, what is, these parallels of thinking and communication, whether it's a machine or whether something we programmed or something we exploit.
It was really interesting to see how the discourse around the book changed. So when the book came out in October, it was a book about an octopus and being able to communicate with this species and trying to figure out its communication methods. And by January, it was a book about AI, and it was fundamentally a book about Evrim, the android in the book, and it was only incidentally about octopuses. And there was even a review that came out in the New Scientist that never mentioned octopuses at all and fully focused on artificial intelligence, which I thought was really interesting. Just watching the way in which the book didn't change, but the whole way that people were speaking about the book shifted. I think you hit the nail on the head, really. I mean, the book is about intelligence, communication, consciousness, and how we define those things, and the difficulties of giving any of them a definition, right? I think it's extraordinarily hard to define what consciousness is, precisely because we live inside it and fundamentally don't understand it. There's a great line in She Walks the Night, I think is the name of the book, and I may be getting that wrong, but it's William Sloan book collected in a recent New York a recent edition called The Room of Mourning, in which there's two of his books collected, where there's basically like a creature from outer space which possesses a woman, and the whole book is about this possession and trying to prove that this being is not a human, but is in fact this creature from outer space who marries one of the characters in the book and has a relationship with him for years. And there's a point in which that creature is found out and says, "Why are you so afraid of me? Like, you claim to be afraid of me because you don't know where I come from, but you don't know where you come from."
Right.
And it's just such an amazing moment of, you know, like it's one of those like great moments where you get chills as a reader, because you're like, yes, like that, like that's it, like that's the problem is like no one understands where they came from and like what life is and where any of that, and yet we often speak as if we don't live in this like totally bizarre mystery of consciousness that we don't understand, right?
Right. And you have a part in your book. And you reminded me of two parts in your book. One where you talk about there's a I didn't write this quote down in my notes, but basically that like our brains are kind of living in this like space that we don't really understand, and in a weird way that's where we're living, right? But also, but you're segueing perfectly to this quote that I have from your book. We came from the ocean and we only survived by carrying salt water with us all our lives, in our blood, in our cells. The sea is our true home. That is why we find the shore so calming. We stand where the waves break like exiles returning home. That is a beautiful quote, sir. That is, I had the exact same feeling you were talking about with that quote, reading that quote. That is one where I stopped and I said to my wife, well, I was reading, she was across the room. I'm like, pause what you're watching. Let me read you this quote. And my wife, who does not like science fiction, Carrie, many times when I kept reading parts of this book, she's like, I have to read that one. And I think this concept of like, I love the idea that the shore is so calming because that's where we come from. And you know, there's a documentary, and a lot of people have become vegan because of it, that Joaquin Phoenix narrated, called Earthlings. And one of the concepts of Earthlings in that movie is to remind people, like, hey, we're no different. We're all Earthlings. We're all in this together. We have this one planet. And this quote, just marrying the unity of our species to the ocean, was very powerful for me in reading this, and elevates this book, I think, from just science fiction to science fiction philosophy, which is, you know, Philip K. Dick would have said many times, like, I'm more of a philosopher than a science fiction writer. He said that all the time. And I'm wondering, like, I don't think you set out to write philosophy in this, but there are so many moments that I found philosophically connecting, you know.
I didn't set out to. So what I set out to do, maybe in the
You're
book,
just expressing yourself. I get it.
yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I set out to. I am reading a lot of more difficult sort of nonfiction works about consciousness and the human, you know, neural connectome and all of these things. And one thing that I did set out to do is to pull those influences into the book and translate them into a prose and you know, like a way of expression that would be more palatable to people to read, because quite often these books are extremely mind expanding but also very, very, very dense, and people just bounce off of them because they're filled with jargon. They're extremely dense. They require a lot of background reading in some cases before you even get into them. You know, I mean, another, like, one of them is Terrence Deacon's Incomplete Nature. You know, I've spent 25 years reading books about semiotics and communications, and that book was really hard for me to read. Like, there were like pages I had to go back and read, you know, 15 times, like 20 times. But there were concepts that I wanted other people to have. Like, I wanted them to have this concept of, you know, there's a quote in the book about meaning, you know, about marks on the paper and how they become meaning in the world, and how we just fundamentally don't understand how meaning works. It doesn't consist of energy. It doesn't have a charge necessarily. It involves none of the scientific like things that we understand, and yet it alters reality, right? Like, you can read a book and it can fundamentally change the pathway of your life, right?
Yeah.
And yet it didn't put anything in you, right? Physically,
Right.
it all occurred in some weird space that we don't understand well. So I wanted to be this translator in some ways of things that I find really philosophically interesting. But I hate binaries, right? I hate the idea that because you do one thing, you can't do the other, because this, then not that. And so, you know, someone had said to me, okay, well, but you can have a book that's really deep, or you can have a book that's really, you know, fun to read. And I was like, and maybe I'm wrong, I don't know. I was like, I feel like you can do both. Like I feel like you can write a novel that is very philosophically gripping and that has like this, like a deep sort of sense of its own ethics and is grounded in those kinds of things, but is also a thriller, and also, you know, has exciting scenes and interesting characters and that kind of thing. I feel like you can do those things.
Yeah,
And so
I think it was done in 1968 with "Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep," for
right.
example, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
You know, I mean,
and,
I feel like
I
it does, you don't have to choose, right?
yeah, we're still trying to unwrap the philosophical layers that Phil was doing in that book, like years later,
Yeah,
and and that book's very hilarious at the same time. So you can do it, and I
yeah,
think with this book is very entertaining for me, but at the same time, I find it entertaining to just have my brain stoked in that way.
yeah, yeah.
So for me, that was enough. But I will say another feeling that this book gave me that I thought was really important is, and doing 30 years of animal rights activism off and on, and having been somebody who's been trying to raise the alarm bells about climate change since 1993, believe me, I've had a lot of moments of dark nights of the soul
Sure.
where this book has characters expressing like how fucking hard it is to live knowing how bad it is. And I
Hmm.
just recently read Raw Deal, which is the Forbes reporter's book about the meat industry. And it's
Hmm.
funny because I didn't need to know any of that. I'm already converted. The choir
Right.
has been preached to, but I wanted to get the latest information. And there were parts of it that were just really hard to read because also this woman's just justifying like why I'm still eating all this stuff. But for me, like it reminded me because I had just read your book of the scenes where the characters are like, do you not understand how hard it is to live with this knowledge, to know how deep and how hard it is. And I think it was really felt good that the book spoke to me, that somebody understood like how, like I've had that conversation with my sister, like it there are moments where in my activism where my wife and I just had to cry it out for a day
Yeah.
because we're like, holy shit, it's so bad. It is so bad. And so your book expressed that, and I just wanted to thank you for that. I don't know if you have any. I talked a lot. It's not really a question.
I appreciate that it's more like a conversation. I like that because you know, honestly, I sometimes come out of these podcasts feeling like this awful sense of just having spoken too much, which I get when, you know, I feel like I'm like dominating a conversation, and I'm very aware of like that,
Well, I
you know.
am here to hear from you. So
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I I think this deep sense of alienation from a society that's clearly like built upon some really weird stuff, right? Is
yeah.
natural in people. And I think that we don't give ourselves often enough space to deal with that. I grew up feeling very much like Ha. Like Ha is, you know, has huge pieces of me in her, right? And I mean,
Right.
all characters are like that. And Altan Setseg was my sort of, you know, way of commenting on also on like other ways I feel about communication and things with people. um but you know, I would tell people say like, well, how could you live overseas for 20 years? And I said like, well, you know, the interesting thing about living overseas for 20 years is that for 20 years I was a foreigner, and I felt like a foreigner, of course, in all these situations. And I struggled, you know, for 15 of those years to just learn Russian, which is an extraordinarily difficult language. And I hammered away at it and chipped away at it and said thousands of stupid things and said things wrong and made mistakes and still make mistakes and did all of this like stuff so that I could do things like read Stanislaw Lem in Russian, right? Or
And
read
come and
War
brag
and
on my
Peace.
podcast about it. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Those are hard won skills that came with tons of embarrassment and feelings of like alienation. And there's almost nothing I think in life more humiliating than trying to learn a foreign language. You really get a sense of how shitty you can feel, especially when you're in an interaction with someone who's not really that interested in helping you communicate, right? And it gives you a great sense of empathy for people. But to come back to sort of what I was talking about, what I say to people, and it's true, is yes, for 20 years, I lived overseas and was a foreigner, and I felt like a foreigner for that entire time. But at least I had a reason for feeling like a foreigner, because for the 27 years before that, when I lived in the United States, I felt like a foreigner every single day, but I had no good reason to account for that feeling. And so I felt like there was something wrong with me. And at least the moment I ended up in Turkmenistan as a Peace Corps volunteer, and no one could understand what I was thinking, and I was completely different from everyone around me, I had a reason for being completely different from everyone around me. And it actually felt good to be a foreigner finally, because I always had this like sense of like, you would start thinking too deeply about things. You'd be like, wait a minute, what the hell is going on? Right? like like why are we doing this? Like what is this thing, this like structure that we live in? Like, why are we behaving this way? It's totally bizarre. This moment where you felt like all of a sudden everything around you was made of glass and you had just fallen through a panel of it into some bizarre like sense of like what the fuck is elementary school, and what am I doing on this playground with these like kids like hucking balls at each other's faces? Like, how is this civilization, right? And then you come back to it and be like, all right, like let's just go, you be like the other kids and it's normal again. And that feeling of being pulled outside of life, and kind of looking at it from this abstract perspective, which I think is part and parcel with writing and wanting and being an artist and being a writer and all those things. That part of that is like this sense of abstractedness, like this ability to like withdraw oneself a layer back or two layers back and look at things critically in a way that allows you to put them together in interesting ways and show them to other people. I think that's a part of creativity, but like that's also like a part of just our general feeling, I think, that of alienation that we don't confront enough, right? And so part of the Mountain and the Sea is like really asking this question about like, well, how well do we actually communicate anyway with one another? There's a great, and I hope that everyone who listens to this podcast will go and read it. There's this great psychological essay. It's sort of an early study in sociology called "They Saw a Game," and it's a brilliant piece of writing because it's actually very beautifully written. And I'm forgetting who the authors of it are. It was published in the 40s, I believe, and it's about a football game between Yale and it's not Yale and Harvard, but it's two Ivy League football teams, and the game gets really violent. And it becomes an infamously violent game, but it's filmed, so they have a record of it. But the two psychologists or sociologists go around and ask different people who watched the game what happened and who was to blame for the violence and like the chaos on the field. And the conclusion that they come to at the end of the study is that no one actually saw what happened on the field, and that there was no game played that was viewed by people. Instead, every single person that they interviewed saw a completely different set of events unfold and remembered it totally differently. And trying to reassemble all of those points of view back into reality just didn't cohere, right?
Sounds like American politics right now.
Right. It really does. It really does. And we live in a world, right, in the United States right now, where a person can just go into a school and slaughter people with this military weapon, which, by the way, I've fired, right? And on full automatic, and I'm well acquainted with. And it's a murder weapon.
That's it absolutely is. Yeah,
it's what it was designed for, top to bottom. And there's, but it's so disturbing to me that we're so abstracted against that kind of like that, again, that sort of veil of ignorance, right? That we're able to pull that straight up to our faces as a country, have these children butchered, blown to pieces, and do nothing, right?
Well, and and I'm going to segue on the power of science fiction, and I'm kind of also promoting the next episode of this podcast that comes out after yours, which is we're doing a debate on the best science fiction novel of 1968. I've already recorded it. And in that year, John Brunner wrote the Hugo Award-winning novel that year was Stand on Zanzibar, which predicted mass shootings as a part of the Rat Pack mentality of what would happen with overpopulation. And he nailed it, unfortunately. And 50 years later, I consider it the best science fiction novel of the 20th century. We got a lot of 21st century to go, but one of the best science fiction novels I've read of this century is Mountain in the Sea. And what it does, similar to what Brunner was doing in Zanzibar, is try to extrapolate what our future will look like based on what we're seeing today.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you talk about in here in this book, and it's funny how you talked about how it changed with the AI, there's a part where this kind of Elon Musk figure of AI is talking to a group and has this hilarious, to me, I laughed a bunch reading it, speech about, what AI means to us and why we have all these guilt fantasies about AI rising up and killing us all. And it's partially because we in the quote at the part of it is, if robots don't rise up, if our creations don't come to life and take power we have used so badly for so long, what we fear isn't that the AI will destroy us, we fear it won't. And it's like this idea that imagining like the Terminator is this scenario of like, well, look how bad it got, so we need them to kind of come get us. And this character is kind of suggesting that it's like a revenge fantasy. And it's such an interesting point that, and I know you're writing this from the perspective of this character who does not think like you do, right? But it was such a fascinating part of the book because I think it is so curious for us to think about what all the robot apocalypse novels that like the AI is coming to get us things like, and you hear people all the time, even the godfather of AI just recently was on the New York Times podcast saying like how dangerous ChatGPT could become if we give it too much power. It's the godfather of the science, right?
Yeah.
And go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I was done. I talked too long. You know how I'm trying not to.
I really believe that's what it is. In fact, I think that there are two different kinds of dystopian sort of apocalypse fantasies. I think one is the like humankind getting what it deserves, right? From the world that it has done horrible things to. And I think that's one strain that we really see a lot of in, say, like mid-century up until now, apocalyptic fictions, is like us being forced to confront what we've done, and then that
guilty. I wrote one of those.
Right. I mean, and I'm like, let me be very clear. I am not denigrating this genre at all. The other one I think is really interesting is,
I'm proud of that book, but yeah.
the reclaiming of manhood and physical strength from its like uselessness, by creating these apocalyptic like zombie sort of scenarios in which like being a strong leader and being able to do things like shoot a gun and all this like physical stuff and corral people into a group, and all of that becomes meaningful again, right?
Yeah.
In this world when we eliminate all of these abstractions and these constructs that have allowed for a large degree of equality, right? And we return to some kind of imagined primitive state in which being the let's be honest, sort of white male like patriarch becomes like this legitimated like reality again. So there's those fantasies too, which point out the fact that, you know, largely I think preppers are not people who are afraid the world will end, right? There are people who are actively hoping for the end of the world so that their lives will be meaningful, right, in some way that they find they're not in the complexities of modern society, right? So those are sort of two fantasies, and the Mountain and the Sea kind of deals with the prior one a little more, right? Like this idea that we will get what is coming to us, or that what we desire from AI and from other minds is for them to force us back from the brink in a way, maybe, right? Or punish us for what we've done and contain us in some way because we can't contain ourselves. The same
like
character,
that the AI that instantly started becoming racist because it like read the internet. And
right? Yeah,
it's like the whole thing of like, I think what the Mountain and the Sea does so well is it looks at the idea of, in the eyes of other intelligences, here is a mirror and what it says about us. And
right.
that's what I think the book does so well. And I'm sorry, I'm kind of mansplaining your book to you. Um,
No,
but
no, no. You're talking to other folks, you know, who are listening, and I get that. I
well,
get
and
that.
I just think that's what it does so well. And I'm so excited that, well, you know, it just it's funny because I told you I went into it cold. I didn't know anything about the plot or anything. Like
Mhm.
I just kept seeing people I trusted on Twitter saying this book's amazing. This book's amazing. So I put it on hold at the library, and I got to buy my own copy so I can read it multiple times. But I put it on hold at the library, and when it showed up, I was like, I didn't even remember why I had put it on hold, which is my system, by the way. So I go into books cold. I'm like, I knew I had a reason why I read this or wanted to read this. Now it's here. And what was so cool is that when I got into it, I didn't have any preconceptions about, because I didn't read the back blurbs. I didn't read anything. I just
Good.
started reading. So I'm like an ideal reader in the sense that you know, I went into it as bare and naked as I could. And the idea is just like, when I figured out what was going on, for me, like it was a revelation purely. Like I just I can't say enough about how good it is. So before we're gonna do a spoiler warning and do a tiny short spoiler section before I let you get back to your evening. But is there anything before we get into spoilers that we want to that you really want to say to people listening um out there, and they, you know, they're not necessarily my listeners. They may have come here looking for you specifically, but you know, what do you want people to know about Mountain and the Sea? What are people getting wrong? Because I know you said something about how the discourse has been, it's kind of funny how it's changed. Is there anything people have been missing that you really wish people would pick up on? Because a book this deep and this thick, like not everyone's going to get everything, right?
Yeah, I
Not to
don't know.
insult people that they
No,
didn't
no,
get it.
no, no. You know, I'll just put it this put it this way. I will not talk down to my readers.
Yeah.
If there's one thing that I fundamentally believe as a writer, and maybe this like will tell you whether you'll love or hate my, you know, my book, is that um, a book is truly a conversation between two people, you know, one writer and one reader, and both of those people need to come to that conversation with a genuine interest in participating in something new and creating something new together. And so when you say that you came to it without preconceptions, you know, I've said before that the way I wish everyone would find The Mountain and the Sea is like on a beach with its covers ripped off and no idea of who had written it or anything, just these pages with, you know, just its content there. Because the marketing and all that stuff, it's extraneous to the text. So if as a reader that's what you want from a book, I think you'll find it rewarding, but that's not a guarantee because, it may not be for you. But for people like you who really enjoyed the book, I would say, like, very honestly, like, and not meaning this in any sort of cheesy way, I'm so glad that you liked it because I wrote it for you,
Mhm.
right? This book has an audience, and that audience are the people who react that way to the book. And there has been a good number of them. I mean, I've gotten a lot of really nice letters from people, saying that they were moved, and that's a huge compliment. Like, and there's also people who hate it, and that's also fine because I don't think I wrote it for them.
Well, it's
Um,
funny because when I posted the review, like there were a couple of my friends who responded like, "It sounds good, but it can't possibly be as good as you're saying it is." And I was like, "No, it can." I don't do hyperbole lightly, and and look, I said this in my review. I think in a just world, there would be, people getting tattoos of the book cover, and people with the cover with the copy of the book under their shoulders as they go to Congress to fight climate change, and you know, uh, people should be reading it in tree sits and on sea shepherd boats, and that's the way, or on the plane ride to work for their non-governmental agency or for NOAA
yeah.
to study the whatever. That's who needs to be reading it, because to me the message is all there. It's all there.
Mhm.
So before we get into spoilers, I just want a last little thing to say. I ain't fucking around, folks. I think this is one of the best science fiction novels I've read, period. But definitely of the 21st century. It's really, really, really good stuff. It's a thinker. It's one that you will go back to, and right there on the shelf for me with like Stephen Graham Jones, The Only Good Indian, and one that should be taught, not just read. And I'm not just saying that because this dude's here. Um, um, but I'm saying it to all you all out there. I had him on because of how important I think this book is. Anything you want to say before we go to spoilers?
No,
Spoilers are gonna be quick this time. I don't have a lot.
I'm kind of speechless. Thank you.
Well, on that note, folks, just one last plug before I get into. I was trying to do a similar thing with The Last Night to Kill Nazis. It sounds like it's a bunch of action and fun. It is, but I'm also trying to get you. I was inspired by all the rise in anti-Semitism that was happening in the last couple of years,
Mm.
and wanted to write a fun book in response to it. And there's a lot deeper issues going on about how we deal with the Holocaust. So I just wanted to say too, I'm not just writing dumb shit either. So I'm trying to have fun too, but trying to make a point. So on that note, let's get into spoilers. This is your spoiler warning. And one of the main things I wanted to talk about in the spoiler warning is that there is a reveal that happened for me in the book that I talked about in my review that I thought will happen for different people at different times. And I was wondering how much this was baked into how you wrote the narrative. And this might come down to you being a crime writer and your other interests.
Mhm.
But I didn't realize that the main AI characters who were AI characters were AI for a long time in the story. And I
Uh-huh.
realized that there were probably hints and clues all along, but I was 2/3 of the way through the book when it was like said outright that Ha was speaking to to an AI, and then I was like, oh shit, okay, that makes sense. But I didn't
Mhm.
realize I just thought this is Ha's friend, this is who she's
Mhm.
talking to. I didn't
Mhm.
think anything about it being an AI until 2/3 of the way through the book. Was that intentional in the writing of the narrative, or was that a
Yes.
happy accident for this reader?
No, yeah, that was intentional. Yeah,
Okay.
I meant for people to think that Ha had this, partner that she was speaking to. The only way the only way I wanted, like, I always want, I give people like a very small hint because some people feel really rewarded by like figuring things like that out early, and then
Yeah.
other people don't. And the only like very small hint that's there is that this is a secure space. right? This island. And there's
Yeah.
just no way that they're going to be allowing any sort of two-way communication to be occurring between Ha and someone off the island, given the like way it's locked down, right?
Right.
And the explanations just don't really add up. So like clearly like the idea that there would be like a channel to someone off the island, like that's the only thing that would, like, you would have to sort of pause at some point and start thinking about that and then go like wait, and kind of follow that all off into Rustem's thread, right? And then pick up on like somehow on, on like, okay, wait, maybe this is a 0.5, right? But
Right.
no, it's not meant to be obvious. I did know it from the beginning, like this, even though I'm sort of, I only usually outline about 4 chapters or 5 chapters at the most ahead. This was something that I knew from the beginning. So he wasn't
Oh,
like a
okay.
real
So that's
person.
an interesting process thing. You outline just to a certain point, and
Yeah.
then do you stop and then outline 4 chapters and then do the next 4 chapters? Is that how you do it?
Generally that's how I did this book. So I would do about 5 chapters ahead, these little kind of 1 paragraph descriptions of what I wanted to happen in that chapter. And then I would write those chapters, and then I would do another
Hmm.
5 chapters or so and write those chapters. I mean, sometimes I would get further ahead in my thinking, and then sometimes I would only be 1 or 2 chapters ahead, maybe.
That's interesting. So when I outline the whole book, but I consider it a living document, and I make changes constantly all the time. And I talk about this in Unfinished BKD, but like that I Joe Hill, Stephen King's son, they're so into pantsing and they're so anti-outline that Joe
Uh-huh.
Hill literally had the character in The Fireman say something about burning outliners at the stake when they're talking about planning a rescue. It's the weirdest thing to be that against outlining, but
I
it's
so
it's
I
so it's so
Go
funny
ahead.
because what I personally think that you're still discovering the book, right? Even if you just, and it sounds like what you're doing is you're allowing yourself to only go a little bit ahead, right?
Yeah, and I guess I want like a combination of um, you know, I like to have a little bit of a sense of where I'm going, and then I don't feel married to that either. If something comes up that changes the structure of the book, then it comes up. One thing that came up in The Mountain and the Sea that was really interesting to me is Evrim. Like I literally was writing that scene, and Ha's walking down the beach, um, and I had no idea who the third person on the island was going to be. And then
Yeah,
Evrim just kind of rose up out of the sand almost and was like,
yeah,
"Oh, it's me." Like,
yeah,
and that kind of completed the book in a way, because like that, like you were saying, that sort of juxtaposition with the octopus intelligence and Evrim as this, sophisticated AI who doesn't know whether they're conscious or not. That was like this that allowed me to do this kind of dialectical, plot line, through line through that in that main space. And so that was neat how that happened. And that really surprised me. And then I had to go and rejigger my whole outline, because that had changed the book. Um, with The Tusks of Extinction, which is the book that comes out in January, and it's a novella from Tor.com. That book I actually sold before I wrote it,
yeah.
and so I had to provide them with like a synopsis, and that was like so painful to write a synopsis for a whole book, because I have this problem where like so my thing is, even though I will outline, I will never talk about a book that's in progress with anyone,
Mm.
because I feel like if I tell the story and then I pull all the energy out, like it saps me from telling the story on the page. And so I won't usually discuss it except with my wife. That's my exception. Is she's my sort of first reader, and we can bounce ideas off of each other, and I feel comfortable in that space. But telling it to like people will say, "What are you working on?" And I'm just like, "Nah, like I can't. I'm not going to talk about that." It's not until I'm done with the thing that I can talk about it. So,
Well, I love writing outlines and synopsises so much to the point that I literally have hundreds of them that I will never write.
well, that's
Um,
cool.
yeah, I just I a lot of times it's the ones that I can't stop thinking about that become novels later. My and this novel was nominated for the Splatterpunk Award for Best Novel, but my ecological dystopia, Ring of Fire from Deadeye Press, that was one that I thought about for 15 years. I outlined it probably 13 years before I wrote it. And then it's just one that never went away. I just kept thinking about it, having ideas. And then I realized I had to do a lot of research for that one. So like when I was about a year out is when I got hardcore about the research, but I tinkered with that outline off and on for 15 years. And then there's some where I'll outline them in a day and then never think about it ever again. And then it's funny, just the other day, there was one I outlined 15 years ago I hadn't thought about. And at one point in that time, but somebody said to me caused me to go look for it and say, maybe I should write that one. So you never know. But I enjoy outlining. But so back to Mountain on the Sea, because this is why we're here. The multiple characters, and when you decided you wanted to have the characters that were on the AI fishing vessel, and you kind of had to switch POVs and all that, did you put much thought into kind of having a rhythm for that? Because I find when I do multiple characters, I have to establish a rhythm, like I'm going back to them every certain number of chapters or something.
Yeah, I played around with that rhythm quite a bit. So I did in the editing process change the chapter orders and do some things to get that right. So I had my beat that I was kind of going through, and then I went back and sort of syncopated it a little bit more because I wanted the reveals to occur in a slightly different order. And some of the, when I say reveals, I also mean sometimes like philosophical stuff. Like I wanted to get to like a philosophical point sometimes a little earlier in the book in one of those 3 tracks that are in the novel. So I played around with a little bit of that. And then when I gave the book to my agent, when I got the agent, for this book, and then Seth Fishman, who's really fantastic, and he read it, and we did a little bit of a rewrite as well, because he wanted to see some things like wrap up differently and tie together. And he was great about pointing out some things that I could link up that I hadn't even thought about. And then I also redid some of the chapter order. One of the things that I did, for example, was like in the first draft of The Mountain in the Sea, Rustem doesn't show up until like chapter 10. And so I pulled that back, and I think it's chapter 5 that he shows up in now. So
it makes more sense to introduce another character that much earlier, because then it establishes the character for.
Yeah, exactly. And so I'm quite often like really unconcerned with like dramatic arcs. I feel like they just like, I try not to think about them too much because I don't want to burden myself with that. And I don't
agents and editors are good for that too, so that will remind you.
Yeah. So I'm in that process right now. I just finished my second novel and gave it to Seth, and then he read it, and now he's giving it back to me with some of his like comments. And so I'm in that. And again, it's nice. Now we're in a more trusting relationship because it's the second book or third book, really, including Tusks of Extinction. And so it's nice to be able to bounce that off of him. And I feel like, one of the things that I've learned as a foreign service officer and just in my day job in general is you need to allow people to do what they're good at. And so, quite often Seth will say like, well, what do you think about this kind of like thing? And I'll say like, well, you are a literary agent, and this is clearly like what you are good at. And so what I want to hear is, what do you think about this? Because I know what I'm good at, and that's not it. Right. Like, but part of that is his understanding of the book from a readerly perspective is superior to mine, because when you're writing your own book, you're both writer and reader, but you're a weird reader.
Yeah.
Your own work, right? You can't feel sometimes the gaps.
Right. And I usually try to pick an ideal reader in my head. And here's a weird trick I do, which is I have a friend, Mark Rothenberg, who's one of my oldest literary book talk friends that we talk about books. And I often think about Mark when I'm writing, because I think about like, and it's dangerous sometimes to think about one person, but for me, like every once in a while I'll think to myself, I'll imagine Mark sitting there and being like, that's too on the nose, and Mark will give me hell for it. And a lot of times things go away because or things get fixed or things get better. And I sometimes send him messages and say, a couple of years from now, you're going to be really excited about something I just did. Like, um,
Interesting.
but it's just funny. It's just a weird tick that I developed for writing, but it works for me. But one thing I really want to get to really quick before we go is SB Divya's Machine Hood, and I'm pointing at it in the shelf as if anyone can see my copy of it, which is a science fiction book I really liked from a few years ago. A lot of that book is about AI rights and machine rights,
Uh-huh.
and so there's an AI Declaration of Rights in that's quoted throughout the book, similar to how Oceans Think by Ha is quoted throughout the book. And she wrote that entire declaration, and she did a whole thing where she, you know, like did the thought exercise of writing it as, how this could be presented to like the government, basically,
Uh-huh.
of AI rights. And I wondered throughout, because and I outed myself on this, but when I was reading your book and I first saw the first quote, the How Oceans Think, I went to Goodreads and tried to search for How Oceans Think because I thought it was a real book that was being quoted, because I didn't like notice that it was the character's name at first.
All right,
And
sure,
I
yeah.
was like super bummed. I'm like, oh wait, this isn't a real fucking book. This was he made it up for this. And then I realized it was the character and then felt super dumb.
Hmm.
But how much of How Oceans Think did you think through? Did you think about her writing it? Did you structure that book, or did you just write the quotes as you came to them?
So there's a book called How Forests Think, which is in the acknowledgments, and How Oceans Think is a bit of like a riff on
On
that
that. Yeah.
on that book, and then a bit of a riff on this book, Other Minds, which is about octopuses. What I tried to do was think through some of the quotes and stuff. Like How Oceans Think is a very dense sort of philosophical book, and then Other Minds as well is like pretty decently dense nonfiction. I tried to sort of think about some of the points that they made that I found had affected me, and then how I could pass them through Ha's character in a way that would make them readable and exciting for a reader, and as if they had been plucked from a larger text, but there is no larger text. I'm not SB Divya.
Yeah.
I did not do that. And there's two books. There's also Building Minds, which is by Dr. Arn Kotlam and Nerva Chan, the sort of Elon Musk character, although I have a lot more sympathy for her than that, and I think she's a better person than he is.
There's a
Um,
lot more Elon Musk in We Can Build You, the book we talked about earlier.
yeah,
If you go
yeah.
back and read that, it's
I should. I haven't read that in decades, and I really should go back and read it. But yeah, I did not do that, and I tend not to overdo backstory in
yeah.
general.
There's no right answer on doing that, right?
No, yeah. Whatever I'm comfortable with. What I do a lot of is research. So in order to write a book, I probably read 100 books for this book, at least.
Yeah.
And that's about typical for me. And then with Tusks of Extinction, which is like half this long, it literally was still like, I think I read 60 books to write that book. And it just goes on like that. But the research is really pleasant to me. I love it. I love learning new things. And being a writer is such a great excuse to learn a bunch of like stuff that no one else gets to like dig into. It's
Right.
wonderful.
I had that experience with Ring of Fire was one of my favorite research experiences. And it's a long story, but something that I got involved with was because I live in San Diego and I'm a big football fan. And I was somehow, because I had this activism experience with environmentalism and animal rights, when the Chargers were threatening to leave, I suddenly was like the only Charger fan that had activism experience. And I suddenly got involved with like trying to keep the team here, and
Uh-huh.
ended up at a meeting at the mayor's office. And here I am writing this disaster novel that takes place in San Diego, and I'm sitting in the mayor's office, and one day I just look at the my contact at the mayor's office, Marshall, and I said, "Hey, just wondering, who develops your master plans for like disaster, whatever?" And he's like, "Oh, it's blah blah blah." And he's like, we call him the master of disaster, and here's his number. And I'm
Awesome.
like, you know, and one of the things that happened with that book was people kept telling me how all the scenes at the mayor's office seemed so realistic. And it's like, I would just sit there and say to Marshall, like, so if there was a wildfire on each side of the city,
Right.
what would you do? And I had all these experiences where, like, this stupid football shit that I was dealing with, like, ended up like being like a boon for research. And I'm sure for you, like working for the intergovernmental agents or for the international agencies that you did, you probably had 100 experiences that
Oh
led
yeah.
to
Oh yeah.
mountains in the sea.
So
Right.
many.
Yeah.
So many of them. Yeah. And that's also why, like, I've always said I love my day job, because my day job feeds my writing and vice versa. So, I don't see moving away from that and becoming a full-time writer anytime soon, because that's just where that's where like a gasoline comes into the engine from, right? Is like that's my fuel, is all those interactions. um I should just warn you that my coach is going to turn into a pumpkin soon,
No, no,
and
no. We're
we'll learn
good.
to go.
We've got we've got a lot. We've gone very far, and I was trying to wrap it up here. So, Ray, a fantastic conversation. I think a lot for readers to chew on. And I'm probably gonna. I'm looking forward to reading your tour novella and possibly talking to you then, because I had such a wonderful time talking to you about this. Um, is there anything else you want to communicate to people with this last few moments?
No, I'd just say, thank you, David. I really I enjoyed this conversation a lot. I genuinely did, and I'm so glad that you enjoyed the book. And I for the people who get that much out of it, again, it's like it's a great feeling as a writer. You want people to get you, right? That's why you do it. Is you want to be understood. I think that's kind of like fundamentally a big part of why we do what we do. And it feels good. Feels good to make those connections. Feels great to have these conversations.
Well, as somebody who lives 6 blocks from the Pacific Ocean here in San Diego, I had a really powerful moment. There was one point where I was reading your book. I was about halfway through, and my wife said, "Do you want to go for a run?" And I had a moment where this novel, like as I was running on the beach, and I thought about that part where that I read that quote to you, because I had just read that line.
Mm-hmm.
And your novel hit me in a way that is almost hard to explain. And I kept bringing up Ishmael because that's the last time a book really warped my thinking. It's not, your book is a better novel. It's a better narrative. Ishmael is almost less like philosophical ideas tied together with little to
Sure.
no story.
Sure.
And but what I thought was great about your book is that I got as much philosophical thoughts out of it, and it was a perfect narrative. So I think all the awards should be thrown at you, and should be back on that shelf behind you in the near future. Whether they are or not, I don't know, but I would vote for you for everything. You knocked the ball out of the park. Well done, sir.
Thank you.
And folks, find that book and find the next ones. Let's make sure we get more science fiction out of Ray Nayler. Let's make sure he never wants to write crime fiction again, because he's so satisfied with the reaction from you science fiction folks. Because we want more of this weird stuff. I would read your crime novels. I probably will if they're already out there, but I because I will follow a good writer to any genre. But I really like your science fiction. Thank you, Ray, for joining us on Postcards from a Dying World.
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me.